This passage may be found on page 467 in the Pew Bible. Beginning with verse 1. I cry aloud to God that he may hear me. In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. In verse 11, I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies thundered. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Oh Our second reading this morning comes from the second book of Kings in the Old Testament. We'll be reading from chapter 2, the first 2 verses, and then verses 6 through 14. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way home from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went, and stood at some distance from them as they were both standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up, and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please, let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet, if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen!" But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes, and he tore them in 2 pieces. He picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he went back and he stood at the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" When he had struck the water was parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
What happens when the water is too deep? From the book of Exodus. The Israelites were camped by the sea, and as Pharaoh and his army drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. And then Moses stretched his hand out over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind all night, and he turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground. What happens when the water is too deep? From the book of Joshua. While all of Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation could get across the river. And when the priests carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the middle of the Jordan, and the soles of the feet of the priests touched dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed the banks of the river once again. What happens when the water is too deep? From the book of 2 Kings. Elijah and Elisha stood at the bank of the Jordan River, and Elijah rolled up his mantle, and he struck the water, and the water was parted to one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed to the other side on dry ground. What happens when the water is too deep? From the local and national news outlets. Turn around, don't drown. All these scenarios associated with deep water are quite literal from Scripture. People trapped by water too high and too deep to cross, and folks needing to get to the other sides. All of these scenarios, with the exception of my weak attempt at humor regarding flash flooding of roads, which none of you laughed at, demonstrates the magnificent power of the Spirit of God at work in the lives of his people when they were in need of a miracle. However, the question I'm posing for us this morning is more metaphorical in nature. What happens when the water is too deep in our lives, in our personal, day-to-day lives? More importantly, what happens when the water seems too deep in our faith lives? What happens when the water is too deep as we journey on our walk of faith? What happens when we hit seemingly impenetrable obstacles? You know, despite the excitement and the pyrotechnics of the amazing story of God's prophet Elijah being swept away into heaven by a horse-drawn fiery chariot from our text this morning, I feel like the main point of this narrative from 2 Kings is the passing of the spirit of Elijah to his protege Elisha. Better said, the passing of God's spirit from Elijah to Elisha, and the journey upon which these two men embarked, leading up to Elijah's ascension. What can we take away from this? Towards the end of 1 Kings 19, you can read the account of Elijah seeking out Elisha to anoint him as his successor. Elisha joined Elijah on his journeys as he continued to do the work of God throughout the countryside. Elisha saw and learned as he witnessed the Spirit of God working in and through Elijah. Elisha knew that God's Spirit was strong with Elijah. And Elisha was faithful as he followed and he learned from his mentor, Elijah. Pause for a moment now and think about your own spiritual journey. Everybody who lives a life of faith has had or still has a mentor. Someone who exemplifies a strong faith both in word and deed. They walk the walk and they talk the talk. Someone who is admired and sought after for advice, counsel, or comfort in difficult times, or in times when your faith seems shaky at best. Someone who without question has the Spirit of the Lord upon them. Do you have this person in your mind's eye? Think about what God has taught you through this person. When you've gone to them and you've asked them what to do when the water is too deep, and what they have said or done, and how you have felt afterwards. Now pause again for just one moment and think about what it will feel like, or what it does feel like, when that special person is no longer around. 2 Kings chapter 2. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal, and Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, because the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and you yourself live, I won't leave you." And so they both made their way to Bethel. Elijah knew his time had come. Elisha himself knew that Elijah's time had come, but he was not quite ready to let go. I remember last summer sitting with and looking at my mother dying in her bed, unable to speak, unable to smile, unable to mentor. Elisha must have been panicked. He must have been afraid. He must have felt like he was grasping at straws. Bible commentators have often used words like mysterious, suspenseful, unknown, or fearful to describe this particular part of the Elijah-Elisha narrative. These same adjectives can be used to describe several of our stops along the path of our spiritual journeys, especially in times of loss. especially in times when we are baffled as to what to do, when we realize that the water is too deep. What do we do when we're faced with the reality that we ourselves are called to rely on the Spirit of God? Ourselves. Rely on God. Well, this was the boat that Elisha had quickly found himself in, and Elijah knew what Elisha was feeling. He knew that his young friend was probably struggling with feelings of grief and a strong sense of doubting himself. When the Lord had called Elijah, and after they had finished traveling, do you remember what Elijah told Elisha? He said, "Stay here. I have to go over here, but you stay here, friend. Just hang out here. There's no need for you to go." I think he was trying to spare Elisha any emotions of misunderstanding. I don't think he wanted Elisha to make any incorrect or misguided assumptions. He wanted Elisha to be confident in the Spirit of the Lord that lay with him. Elisha did not need to be dependent on the Spirit of God in Elijah. No, rather, Elisha needed to trust and believe that this same Spirit was alive, present, and working in him, too. But Elisha was still not ready to let go. We even begin to sense that Elisha might be afraid that he would be unable to carry on the work that Elijah had been doing for the Lord. He hung on, and he followed Elijah anyway, despite what his mentor had instructed. And if you look closely at the path that these two men took in the first part of 2 Kings, it's an interesting path. Elijah's final destination was going to be on the other side of the Jordan River. But before he got there, he basically journeyed in circles. It was a journey, but it wasn't a quest. He was just going from here to there, going around in circles. And I think it was in an effort to wear Elisha out and to discourage him so that he might give up and quit following. No luck, though. Verse 6 finds these two men almost at the final destination, the Jordan River, and they needed to cross the river before Elijah could be taken away, but the water was too deep. Without hesitation and confident in the Spirit of God that dwelled within him, Elijah rolled up his mantle and he struck the deep waters of the Jordan, and the waters parted, revealing a dry path through which Elijah and Elisha could pass. Imagine what must have been going through Elisha's head at that moment. Elijah knew what was on the other side, and yet his faith and confidence in God remained strong and steady. Elisha, on the other hand, he's kind of the opposite. He was a little unsure, probably a little afraid and doubtful, as he found himself caught up in this mysterious and the unknown of these current circumstances. "Oh, Elijah, please let me inherit a double share of your Spirit before you go." I remember the day when my mom told me that the doctor was putting her in hospice care. He'd given her 5 short months to live. I was terrified. I was angry, and I was very confused. And I also marveled the next 5 months as she lived out those days in pain and discomfort with a genuine sense of joy and thankfulness. "Mom, please let me inherit a double share of your Spirit." Verse 11. As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended into heaven in a whirlwind. And Elisha, watching, cried out, saying, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could not see them anymore, he grasped his clothes and he tore them into pieces. What was Elisha to do now? Elijah was gone. Elijah's mantle was laying right there at Elisha's feet. the Jordan River was no longer dry, and it separated Elisha, the prophet, from the other side with waters that were too deep. What are the waters that you've encountered in your life that are too deep? Maybe it's associated with your marriage. Maybe it's something that you struggle with, some type of an addiction. Maybe it's your job. Maybe relationships with others. Maybe you come up against a river that's too deep and full of depression. Perhaps apathy. Maybe it's something as simple as gossiping or stretching the truth in order to gain acceptance from others. What are the obstacles you face in your life that are too big for God? And when will you learn to lean on God instead of others when the waters are too deep? The scriptures tell us that Elijah had dropped his mantle, and Elisha picked it up after he left, and he struck the waters of the Jordan River, and he said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And when he struck the waters parted to one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. You know, earlier in this narrative, Elisha has kind of been depicted as a totally dependent protege to Elijah, a man who had faith, but who was living out that faith vicariously through his mentor, Elijah. Elisha had seemingly turned a blind eye to what was about to come and had silenced the future and any of the possibilities that future might hold. He was hanging on to Elijah. He shouted out, he wept, and he tore his clothes in grief as he saw Elijah depart. But in a moment of mystery and wonder, Elisha endures a personal transformation. Yes, Elisha's initial reaction to Elijah's departure was sorrow and despair. And even as he crossed back over the Jordan on dry ground, he continued to call out to the God of Elijah. However, if you were to read further into that passage of Scripture, we see that as Elisha approaches that group of other prophets who had been following them at a distance just to see what was going to happen, we see Elijah exert a calm and quiet confidence as he speaks to these men and explains to them what had happened. And soon after, as we read throughout 2 Kings, Elisha begins to operate as a prophet in his own right through the power of God's Spirit that dwelled within him. I hope that this resonates with you the way that it has resonated with me this morning. The text itself seems to mirror our faith journeys. Through no planning of our own, God touches our lives through others. And we believe. And as fledgling believers, we're often guided and mentored by others in the faith. And sometimes we feel as if we don't understand this faith or that we can understand what God is doing with us. Sometimes it really does feel like we're on some pointless journey going around and around in circles. But for some reason, unbeknownst to us, we stick with it anyway. And then out of nowhere, we find ourselves being led into a strange world across the Jordan River into some sort of circle or an inner circle of meaning. We realize that we too want to inherit the power of this text, inherit the power of this Spirit, the power of the Spirit of our own Elijah. Oftentimes, once we realize our Elijah has ascended from us, hopefully we understand that he's left behind for us traces in the form of a new outlook or a changed perspective. All right, let's try to simplify this. Elisha did not realize that he possessed the same Spirit of God that possessed Elijah. He was reluctant to rely on God's power all by himself, so he essentially seems to be using Elijah as a crutch. He greatly feared the departure of Elijah because he was afraid he couldn't fill those shoes, and he was right. He couldn't, if he was planning to fill them with his own power. But once he called upon God and the waters were parted, puzzle pieces began to come together for him. So this is the question for us today. When will we fully realize that the same Spirit of God that allowed Moses to part the Red Sea, the same Spirit of God that enabled Joshua to part the Jordan, and the same Spirit of God that enabled Elijah to part the Jordan on the way over and enabled Elijah to part it on the way back, is the exact same Spirit of God that dwells within us as believers today? It's the very same one. We don't have to rely on ourselves or others when the waters are too deep. We don't have to rely on ourselves when faith-questioning obstacles block our paths. The God of Elijah is the same God that we worship here this morning. The God of Elijah is the same God who promises to love us, to care for us, to protect us, and guide us today, if only we put our full trust in Him. When we learn to put our faith in this God, we can be assured that we will be granted that double portion that Elisha had asked for. What happens when the water is too deep? It's up to you, but know this: the Spirit of God that exists in you is powerful. And God is waiting to part the waters for you. The choice is yours. Amen.